comms debate. While we're kind of getting settled here, we'll give a few more minutes for people to drop in. I see there are a lot of people still joining. Just leave us a message in the questions tab, should have on the right side of your screen. Just drop us a message of where you're from. It's always nice to see kind of where people are tuning into for these live sessions. And yeah, we have people from around the globe too. Brad, it's pretty early for you. Did you happen to have your coffee yet?
I actually have a nice cup of tea ready to go.
Nice cup of tea.
Yep, West Coast here on a gray, dark day.
Gray and dark. That's kind of like Helsinki, Finland. Actually, it is very dark now. I mean, the sun is already set. And we also have Jen and Advita from the UK. What's the UK looking like today?
Well, it's saying it's going to be the coldest day of the year, but it's quite pleasant for us. Just, it's got to wear a jumper. It's, what we're used to.
Really sunny here today. Well, I'm actually in London, not in Manchester today, so I'm privileged to welcome some sunshine and no rain. So I'm quite chuffed to be here, actually. So I'm speaking from a hotel in London.
All right, that sounds good. And looking at the chat tab here, we have messages flooding in. We have Chicago, South Africa, Edinburgh, Denmark, London, Prague. We have people literally from around the globe. So thanks again, everybody, for taking the time out of your evening or your afternoon or your morning, wherever you're from, to listen in. But I think we could go ahead and get started with some brief introductions. If you joined the previous comms debate, you might know me. I am Alex. I'm the product marketing manager here at Smart, but I don't really want to talk much about myself today. I'd rather focus on our three amazing speakers. So first off, Jennifer, how about you introduce yourself real quick?
Hi, so as it says, I am Jennifer Sproul. I am the Chief Executive of the Institute of Internal Communication. And we are a membership body based here in the UK that solely looks at the internal communication profession. So we are what it says on the tin, from looking at how we can advance content, conversations, skills, careers, education, professional development. So my job really is to lead that organization, work with our board, and also hopefully talk more about the value of internal communication with other lovely people like yourselves.
Awesome. Thanks again for hopping on. Advita, how about you?
So I own my own business called Comms Rebel, which is a fairly new business for me. Only started in January. So prior to that, I was used to work for the energy sector, and I worked at Manchester Airport as well as a senior communications manager. I'm also the chair of the Chartered Institute of Public Relations Internal Comms Committee and a board director for the Chartered Institute of Public Relations as well, which is predominantly UK based, but we do have some global members out there. So if anyone is international, then please, international members of CIPR, then put it in the questions and say hello.
All right, sounds very good. We had I'm getting some feedback on somebody. Okay, I think we're better. Just real quick before I go on to Brad, Jen, there was a comment in the chat here that somebody could not hear you. Could somebody else verify in the chat or questions that can you or can you not hear, or could you hear Jennifer's introduction? If not, then Jen, maybe you just need to hop off and hop back on. That might be possible.
Do you want me to wait a minute?
Okay, so we have people saying that they can hear you. So maybe who was it? It went so fast. The chat's going so fast.
It was Chineen Williams.
Yeah. So if you, it might be just how about you try relogging? You might it might refresh the audio and you'll hear it. But Jennifer, it looks like you are fine.
Excellent. Thank you.
Good. And last but not least, we have Brad. We already heard that you're from dark California today, but how about a bit of a longer introduction?
Oh, thanks very much. And it's great to see this global audience joining us for this session. Name's Brad Whitworth. I am a senior communications manager at Hitachi Vantara. I have tech in the background. I worked for HP for many years, also for Cisco. Been Northern California and Silicon Valley type for quite some time. Pulled the ripcord a few years ago and moved to wine country, where I am fortunate enough to be able to get to work remotely all the time. I am a past chair and a fellow in IABC, the International Association of Business Communicators, and recognize a lot of IABC names coming into the audience. So thanks for joining us today.
Very good, very good, and thank you for being here again. And thank, of course, all of you for hopping on and agreeing to share your wisdom with our crowd today. Really quick before we get into the actual debate and actual statements that we're going to be covering, just kind of a recap or a kind of introduction on how this session will be structured. So we will propose 6 internal communications related statements. Like if you're interested, these statements were kind of curated from our speakers and handpicked to make sure that you guys get the most bang for your buck for tuning in today. Each speaker will have roughly 30 to 40 seconds to either agree or disagree with each statement. And after that, we'll open it up for roughly 5 minutes for our speakers to discuss amongst themselves on that topic. At the end, we have reserved 15 minutes for questions. Now, just a word of warning, last time we got so many questions during the actual debate that we kept bringing them up and bringing them into the discussion that we didn't have time at the end for questions. So just if you, at any point, if you have a question, feel free to drop it in on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll try to interject it whenever we can. If it's relevant for that specific topic, we'll definitely bring it up as long as we notice it. Also, if anybody is kind of multitasking there, be sure to follow our Great Comms Debate hashtag on Twitter. I hear that we have our marketing manager is tuning in and also live tweeting the event. So some more insights to be had on that channel. All right, but how about we then just get into the actual debate? And for the first statement, I think this will be an interesting one for anybody interested in the field of kind of company culture and employee experience as well. We're going to start off with internal communication cannot manufacture culture. And I think Jennifer, for this one, we'll go ahead and start with you. Do you agree or disagree?
I agree. I think that there's a lot of debate about, and there's a lot of things out there saying great culture is an absolute organizational differentiator. You need a great culture. But to assume or to think, however, that internal communication can simply manufacture that culture through values on a walls, embedding in communications, and that by doing that is going to suddenly magically engender this way and these values, I think it is not the role of internal communication. Our role really is to ensure that people feel connected, that they feel purposeful, and that they feel informed about, so that we can help support and drive the organization's performance. And culture, anyway, as a topic, is far more complex than simply being around communication. It's driven through experiences, behaviors, and interactions, let alone before we get to corporate culture versus organizational culture versus subcultures. So we need to understand culture and build strategies within that that supports it or drives it to help organizations and people succeed, but it's not our job to manufacture it.
All right. So Advita, how about you, hearing what Jen just said?
I totally agree with Jen. I don't think it is our role to do that. I think we definitely support culture, and I think we need to work with our leadership team to do that. We can write as many, fancy words and make it sound really good, but if the behaviors in the business are not driven by the people there, like leadership team, then we will struggle to manufacture that culture. And I think putting that pressure on the comms team alone to drive culture is probably not the right thing to do. And as Jen says, we definitely help support that, but we can't manufacture it alone.
Gotcha. Brad, how about you?
Well, sadly, we're often chartered with manufacturing culture. So I disagree with the statement. I think that the verb manufacture is the one that I'd probably quibble with a little bit. I think we can capture it. I think we can reflect it. I think we can reinforce things that are going on. I think we can help try to explain it, point out when it's working well. But to expect us to create it on our own is a bit too much to expect of a comms team.
Okay. And I guess thanks again for the quick kind of introductions on your thoughts to the topic. I think one thing that I'd like to bring here, Brad, building on your comment, is actually something we had in the previous comms debate. We had a statement where culture is owned by IC and HR. So how do you feel, like, building off of what you just said, how do you feel about, who actually then, who manufactures culture, who's the driver of culture in an organization?
Not all at once, but I'll jump in and sort of say, I actually think this is a responsibility of senior leadership in an organization. And our job is to make sure that some of their actions line up with whatever words that is that we might be using to describe this thing that's evolving. I also think the flip side of that is, I think sometimes we do a disservice by capturing culture and trying to codify it, because in some ways a culture is a living, growing, changing kind of an organism as opposed to something static. And if you write it down and say, this is what culture is, people can often go, oh, that's not our culture, and point to little things, behaviors that are not, when maybe that's the way that should be growing.
I agree. I think Brad's 100% spot on, saying, culture is growing organically. And I think, comms can definitely support with the vision and what the leadership team want to do on that side. But it has to be work. You have to work collaboratively. You have to demonstrate the behaviors in real life, in person. You can't write one thing and then do another. Things like values on walls and writing really fancy newsletters and doing updates on the intranet, if that's fine. But if your leaders and the stakeholders in your business are not demonstrating those values or behaviors, then you have absolutely no control over that. And you have to work really closely with them to make sure that you are translating what the actual culture is in the business. Otherwise, it's not authentic.
I agree as well. I think it's complex, and as organizations in design get more complex as well, we talk very much about organizational culture, but there is those mini cultures, those mini nucleuses, and actually what we might say and what we might feel in our day-to-day interactions can be very, very different. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to be good or bad. I'm not saying one way or the other, but I think that just think it's a one sort of size fits all culture as a concept. I think we have to, as internal communicators, really understand those nuances and where they exist and where it works well and where it doesn't, and where not just the leaders' behaviors above, but the behaviors then that exist within teams and how that works. It gets quite complex, I think, but we have to spend, I think, our energy as internal communicators to really understand culture and the theory of culture so that we can work within it and do our best. I think that's certainly a challenge we need to get better at.
Right. I hear a lot of you guys talking about, the role of leadership in culture, and overall in internal communications, the role of leadership and senior leadership has been well kind of documented and heavily discussed. Is there any way that if your senior leadership isn't, willing to kind of drive culture, is there anything you can do from a communications perspective to kind of nudge them in that direction? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to do something like that?
I think it's important to find out why. And I think as internal communicators, we can often be scared of that word and asking, especially senior leaders and chief execs, why, what is it that's the barrier? Why is it that they don't want to do this? Have they got a different vision, or what are they not comfortable with? And I think it is our role to discover that from them and work closely with them and build that trust so they can be open with you. Because they're often, no leader with, a commercial leader as well at that level, it would say, be purposely a blocker, but there has to be a valid reason on why they are. And I think as internal comms, we're in a good place to potentially ask that why. And I think sometimes we can be scared of that.
Oh, you're right. I think what Advita says, if we think about employee voice and what we can do with that as one of the sort of the key enablers, we can add real value in activating that. But again, that also comes back to people feeling that they can authentically, or they can have a voice. So sometimes we need to listen, but also listen to the silence and why is there silence, and dig deeper. And I think that's a challenge as well.
Great to say that. I think we can help with this whole bubble up notion. I mean, one of the things that we're supposed to be your eyes and ears across the entire organization. If we see examples of things that are reflective of the culture that we aspire to, I think that finding them and pointing them out. The other tough part with the word that I have in manufacture is that sort of is sort of like an instant creation. And I think the other piece that we all would agree upon is the culture takes a long time to evolve. It's not an overnight, you build it and therefore it is. It takes time to weave its way through an organization. One of the things you can do as a communications person is find the people who reflect that, who've been there for a while, especially if it's a long-standing organization, who truly embody this thing and highlight the why it is that they are a reflection of the culture that you hope to build across the organization.
All right, that sounds very good. I think I think a key thing here was that we highlighted was, or that you guys highlighted was this, not being, as a communicator, not being afraid to kind of, like Advita said, ask the question why, and just kind of be more assertive in situations like that. But hey, great discussion, and I think we're up on time on this one, so let's go ahead and move on to the next statement, shall we? All right, and the next one, I particularly like this one myself. So the statement goes, IC should always sit within HR. And for this one, Advita, how about we start with you?
I disagree with this statement. I don't think IC should always sit within HR. I think it's completely dependent on what is happening in that organization in terms of where IC should sit. And to be perfectly honest, I don't think it really matters where IC sits, because I think it's important that wherever you sit, you connect the dots, and you should never, as a team, especially an internal comms team, work in isolation. So even if you're sat within IT, which I've heard it happen before, and it's not, in my personal view, it's probably not the best place, but even if you are sat within an IT function, then it's important that you still connect the dots with HR and finance and the other departments in the business, so you still have that umbrella view. But there is a lot of debate, and especially in the UK, around HR and IC and who drives what and how does it work, and it can take the attention away from the actual role that IC do play. So I think we should stop focusing on where IC should sit and focus on how you can make it work wherever you sit.
Gotcha. Brad, would you agree or disagree?
I would disagree that it should always sit within HR. However, I will also counterbalance that with if you've got a great HR leader who is supportive of the internal communications function and maybe came from internal communications, I would want to be sitting there alongside that person day in, day out. And so I almost go back to who are the champions for the internal communications function, and park me there. Having been in an HR organization, been in a corporate communications, been in a marketing role, and doing internal communications and all of those things, it's possible to be successful anywhere. But let me get somebody who's this true believer. And if they're in HR, I'll be signing up.
All right. Jennifer, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I disagree with the statement. I'm picking up on both what Advita and Brad have said. I think that also what's driving this kind of attention with this issue, particularly as we say in the UK as well, is that it depends. It's not necessarily where we're sitting, which is making us feel like this. It's how the leader that we're reporting to views the value of internal communication. And that can be challenged whether they're a HR leader, corporate comms, marketing. If they don't see internal comms as valuable, then we're not getting the remit, the conversation, or the exposure that we want. So I think that rather than focusing on where we sit, focusing on how are we demonstrating our reputation and showing our value and changing those perceptions, irrelevant of where our leader sits. And I think as well, we need to really think about what makes us really deliver is when we bring all of our unique skills, whether that's marketing, HR, comms together, and we share a common goal. And I think that one of the things as internal communicators, and that's something we're going to be working more on here, is driving actually building our stakeholder relation skills. And actually, if you've got a challenge, don't worry about where you sit, worry about how you're building that relationship, and then finding even the small things to show your value and where your skills can help them. I think that's where we need to focus our energies rather than worrying our reporting lines. It's just a misplacement of energy.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha. And something that kind of a few of you guys alluded to is these kind of different, having some champions for that regardless of where you sit, where they sit, having champions from an internal comms perspective. I think there's an interesting point that Deppy just brought up is on the previous statement as well, is using culture champions can help driving culture in an organization. How about using these communications champions within an organization? Where are they? Who are they? Where do you typically find them?
I think I completely agree with you. I think it's important to have sponsors in the business, regardless of where you sit. And I've always kind of, rather than approaching, leaders as a whole function, I try and break them down one by one and try and get them to sponsor what we're trying to achieve. And they're always champion you at the, the board level. We always talk about having a seat at the board and we want a seat around the table. You don't necessarily have to have that seat around the table to make an impact. If you've got champions and sponsors doing that for you, then you can get on with the work that has the bigger impact, I believe. And I think, having that sponsorship and having those champions is probably crucial to the success of your role in the business.
And it also has something to do with how big the IC organization is. I mean, if it's an IC organization of one, maybe where you sit in an organization has something to do with it. But I've been lucky enough to have worked in some large multinationals where we have people who do internal communications who are actually embedded in business units and functional areas within the organization and have dotted line back into whatever corporate function there are. I've also seen the model where you have a centralized corporate communications function on the internal side of things with the dotted lines out. And it's back to what you were saying, Advita, you really need to build the bridges no matter which side of the bridge you sit on, you'd better be connected. The other thing I'm seeing is a lot of internal communications people who are doing executive communications, who are doing some media relations, who are doing some other sets of roles, and that need to be able to be plugged in, and maybe to be plugged into that function is an important aspect of the role.
I'd agree as well. And I think that our job as well is to really kind of spend that time, as everyone's saying, is to really understand our stakeholders and understand how can we plug ourselves in. One of the things I remember someone saying, using like the SCARF model as a way of assessing what somebody's going to be going and what's going to appeal to them. So I can see where they're at and I can see what they want and just come in and plug in, or find people in your network to plug in and show against their need and what they're looking for, how we can be a solution. And it takes time, but it's that effort will pay dividend in the future, I think.
The other thing I think that we need to make sure that communications people do, no matter where they sit, is strive for independence. I mean, the downside to being within any one function is you get pigeonholed and seen as, oh, they just do HR communication stuff. They're not here to serve us. So I think this idea of making it clear from the get-go that we are here to serve the entire population, not just because you sit in HR doesn't mean we do HR communications only.
Right.
Great.
That's a really good point to end on, that it doesn't matter which department you sit in. Your role is IC and you have to kind of manage that process then from there. Okay, good. Thanks, guys. I think we can go ahead and move on to the next statement here, which is face-to-face communication is still the best way to communicate internally. Brad, what do you have to say about that?
I'm going to disagree with a statement that I think I actually created and years ago did some research work and proved that face-to-face communication is a great way to go. And I think the reason I would disagree is that in an ideal world, if every manager, every supervisor, every leader were a great communicator, this would be the best way to go. But many fall short, and some of it's our fault, some of it's also just personality of those folk. I think we do sometimes a cruddy job of equipping them with communication skills and the technologies and the wherewithal to do it. Yeah, face-to-face is best, but I think the difference is, as we have moved away from organizations that are geographically bound and an immediate manager / supervisor / leaders were in the same building / neighborhood with you, we have to go a little bit above and beyond face-to-face communication. Ideally, yeah, but real world,
All right, Jennifer, what do you have to say to that?
Yeah, it's kind of one of those statements which I agree and disagree with, which is not very helpful, but I'll go with agree to help, balance the conversation.
That's very political of you. Yeah.
I know, we're learning a lot here in the UK at the moment. So I do agree. I mean, if you look at the results that come out in the UK every year, that always says as a channel, face-to-face communication is the most effective. So that says that, and that we know that. And if you put the energies into your face-to-face elements from in terms of, whether it's the leadership events and that sort of things, they are very, very effective. Why? Because they have context, they have physical communication as well as verbal and word communication. They enable time for people to ask questions, be given consultation to understand. So yes, in that regard, I agree. However, picking up on Brad's point, I think that the future, we have to be careful of what face-to-face is going to look like, the scalability of it. How can we make the new age digital face-to-face work? But the flip side of where it's going to be challenging is actually the majority of face-to-face communication that happens isn't at leadership events. It's in the everyday. It's amongst our managers. It's amongst our teams, which is also our number one biggest barrier to effective internal communication. So it's a real dichotomy. So yes, it's effective, but we have a lot of work to do to build good communicators within our organizations to actually really become a really good cascade, I guess, is a way of looking at it.
Right. I want to put a pin in the idea of new age face-to-face communication. But first, Advita, would you agree or disagree with the statement?
I agree with the statement. I do understand what Brad and Jen both mentioned there. But working in-house as an internal comms for the last 15 years and 16 years, like this is every time we do a pulse check or a survey and we ask that question, that face-to-face communication is still the preferred method of people getting information, regardless of what fancy tools we've got in place and Microsoft face what's it called, can't remember the name now, the Facebook thing and Yammer and things like that. Nobody chooses that as the first preferred option. Face-to-face always comes up as a workplace. Sorry, Microsoft Workplace. Face-to-face always comes up as a preferred method, and I do think it still has. In terms of credibility and getting that integrity and having that relationship with that manager, I think it's really important that we still continue to push this in the organization. There may be different methods we do this. It doesn't necessarily have to be in person. It could, like I think Jen said before, on the tech, we need to look at the tech. We've got amazing technology. Look at us here. This is a classic example of, having a global conversation with hundreds of people from across the globe, but you can see our faces and you can still have that conversation and still see the impact and body language and reactions and stuff. And I think that is something that we need to still consider and not go too far to the side with tech, even though that does have a place.
Right. I think one thing I wanted to highlight here, I see some good questions coming in the chat, but one thing I wanted to bring out was this idea of new age face-to-face communication. So what is face-to-face communications these days? Is this face-to-face communications? Is it a video call or is it just standing in a room? What's your take on that?
I think we have to be open to this is part of how it's in an ideal world. But for me as a leader of my organization, I'm lucky I have a small team. We are all about face-to-face. That's how we interact. But with my community and the people, my shareholders, if you like, who are my members, ideally, I would speak to them all face-to-face individually all the time so I can really get that value added. But it's not possible. It's not scalable. It's not. Also, they become moments in time. They don't filter through all the everyday. So I think we have to be adaptable and think about how are we using these tools and training our people, our leaders, to perhaps maybe adjust certain styles that fit this new way of doing, because it's a tool that can work for us, that can fill that gap. So I guess this style is probably new age face-to-face. Whether we'll all be robots with like holograms, who knows? I think that's all on the list, but we have to look at, because sometimes how we appear face-to-face on video and from person, they can be different. So we have to think about, if we're going to build up around those big face-to-face moments, how are we using these to supplement that?
Mm-hmm.
Years ago, I was able to go into some survey work that had been done in the organization and prove that the better job a manager or supervisor does in communicating with an employee face-to-face, the more satisfied, the more engaged, the more productive the employee was. And published some articles about that. And I wouldn't say I got my wrist slapped, but let's have a reality check from one of my colleagues in IABC fellow Angie Sinicus. Great person on measurement. And what she points out is that if you ask an employee where they would like to get their information, the supervisor managerial level comes out as sort of the first overall choice, but not when you ask the right question, which is, where would you like to get your information about finance? Where would you like to get your information about HR? Where would you like to get, and you can sort of fill in the blank of the what kind of information. And what happens there is my manager, my supervisor drops down to number 2, and there's probably a better source for that. So face-to-face, yeah, great. My manager, great. They can provide some context, great. However, they're sort of like in the number 2 spot in a lot of positions, and therefore they end up with an overall ranking of 1, but they're not the best. So I think we need to work on that. I still also think the other piece that we really haven't talked on, we've been talking more this hierarchical manager, supervisor, leader kind of communication and face-to-face, but there's also that peer-to-peer kind of communication as well, the non-formal networks that exist in organizations. And again, ideal, it's the kind of thing that's at the coffee pot, it's at the, the ashtray for those who still cigarette smoking outside, but there's this ashtray the size of the Sahara Desert, and people get together and commute. But it's the best is face-to-face.
Gotcha. I think one thing, and again, I see so many great questions here, but some of them are actually related to a topic we're going to be discussing soon. So that's always good to see. But one thing that I did want to highlight from here was from Isabel, where this concept of like bottom to top face-to-face kind of, face-to-face top to bottom communication isn't necessarily feasible. Like you can't, Jeff Bezos can't go talk to every employee from Amazon. So how do you feel like if face-to-face is so strong, how can we make these kind of alternative face-to-face communications channels work in this context?
I think it's more about that human connection, and it's about having that connection. So Amazon is a good example. Like obviously Jeff can't get around and speak to every single employee face to face. It's impractical and probably really expensive, but it's about having that connectivity to Jeff and understanding what he wants, and hopefully if he's a good leader, it will go down the chain of command in essence. So people should be representing what he or the culture of Amazon is and comes across. So you don't necessarily need to speak to Jeff to get the essence of what Amazon is and what's going on. You should be able to speak to your direct line manager. And Brad made a good point before about using peers and internal influencers. And I think I went to a resilience training workshop yesterday, and there was a guy speaking, a manager that manages 180 people. And he said, the lack of human contact is impacting well-being and mental health in the organization. And that is something that managers can pick up a little bit earlier to understand what is going on in their team. And I think if you move that human connection away, you lose the essence of what's going on in that organization and what's happening within your team. So it may not be a direct face-to-face, conversation, but as internal comms, we should be able to support our leaders and our peers and the stakeholders basically in the business to understand what good communications is and what good face-to-face is. And whether you do that via Zoom or someone like Jeff does a video occasionally or, does a live stream, there's so many different ways now you can get that interaction with somebody that you just have to be a little bit more creative in my view, but we should be able to support our leaders in having that training and giving them the guidance and where to get that information from. That's a big one as well.
Well, and I think to build on what you were saying, I think the other piece is we need to turn the formula upside down and be responsive to what it is that employees want to hear as opposed to what it is that leaders and supervisors want to tell. I'm reminded of a great practice that Cisco's former CEO, John Chambers, did, which is 6 times a year he did a thing called birthday break, and you had all the January and February birthdays invited to this thing. It was a webcast, and people around were encouraged to ask questions. In fact, Chambers would march into the room and say, I don't have anything to tell you. I'm here to answer your question. Who's going to be brave enough to ask the first question? It became their meeting with their agenda, and the way he responded was very, very different than a quarterly performance review of some sort. So I think you can build those ties. You can use these broadcast kinds of tools, these things that reach across the miles and across time zones, to be able to reinforce that basic human thing, which we all covet, which is face-to-face, in person, would be the ideal.
Yeah.
Right. All right. Good. Again, I love this discussion, and we have a kind of related topic coming on in a few statements. So we'll kind of push some of this that way. But I think we can go ahead and keep the show rolling. So next up, we have a statement that employee experience is the future. And Jen, why don't you go? 30 seconds. Agree or disagree?
I do agree, but I think that we have a lot to educate ourselves on what employee experience really is going to look like. I think there's no doubt that customer experience is phenomenally changing the whole consumerism and the way organizations are behaving now. It's much more evidence is out there that customized, personalized, human-centric wraparound experiences are actually driving loyalty. We know we've been talking about it, and probably in the last 5 years, I think Deloitte did a piece of research a while ago where it said I think it was a very US sample, 80% of executives rated this as very, very important, but only like 22% are really, really tackling it. So we need to think about how we give that parity, how with customer experience and how we make it of value. But I think we must be sure that employee experience is not just a digital workplace with a personalized dashboard.
Gotcha.
It's going to be far more complex and considered. So employee experience is not just internal comms. It's about how we make personalized careers, how we blend together reward, L&D, engagement, that whole centric piece, and create memorable experiences, but they should still be built with the human-centric at heart. So I think it is going to change. I think it is going to impact the way we do things, maybe the way about how we think about being more facilitators, conversational dialogue, but it's not necessarily all of internal comms as remit, and it's not about technology. It's far greater and wider than that.
All right, that was a long 30 seconds.
Sorry.
But I didn't want to stop you. Advita, how about you next?
I do think it's a future, yes, and I do think that internal comms have a big part to play in that future. I remember, 4 years ago when people were talking about employee experience and employee engagement, what's the difference, what does it mean? And at the time I was like, oh, it's a bit of a buzzword, but now I've definitely changed my mind about it. And I think people are definitely going down that route of employee experience. And Jen's spot on, like, it's not just about, give them an induction and let's say crack on with your life and see you when you leave kind of experience, or it's more about every touch point that employee has in that business, from the minute they apply for that role to the minute they leave the organization, and what their experience is in between. And as internal comms, we can definitely have an influence on how that journey for them may be, and impact the organization as a whole with employee experience.
Right.
Definitely.
Brad, how do you feel?
I'll be a little bit of a contrarian on this. I don't think it's the future. I think it's our past. I think it's our present and the future. It's been our charter from the get-go. I would also say that while internal communications is a key driver in all this stuff, I would also love to see us get out of this business. My thought is it's not us creating the experience, it's us creating the environment in which the culture can expand.
All right, that's interesting, and that's a really good kind of segue to lead into the conversation. So if internal communications is the one kind of creating that environment, who then creates the actual experience, and how does IC support, other than, of course, kind of creating that environment?
Well, and it almost gets back to something we've touched upon a couple of times, which is there really one experience, or is this something that needs to be very, very individualized? And the people who work in the R&D organization, is the experience that they have going to be different than a salesperson's experience? And maybe what we have to do is release this idea of a one size fits all, the control, we're going to develop it, it's going to be look like this is the ideal, and give people enough training and tools and wherewithal to be able to create these mini experiences here, there, and elsewhere. That environment, which, I think the other piece that we have to recognize is that the power in the organization really does reside at the edge. And those of us who are fortunate enough to work sort of centrally located, we need to stay in touch with what's happening at the edge and create the experience, make sure the culture is reflected, know that the people who are closest to the issues are the ones who should be driving this as opposed to us.
Right.
I think that's I agree with everything you've just said, Brad. I think that experience as a concept is, if we were all the same and robots and we would all respond to the same stigma, environment, conversation, tools, gosh, wouldn't it be a lot easier? But sadly, that's why it has to be human centric, and it has to be considered with that in mind. And I think that, there's lots of things that we can do now to enable it, but I think it's going to take a new perspective organizationally wide about how we run, how we make things happen. And then we have that pivotal role to help create the environment, whether it's enabling better conversation, better dialogue, whether it's training and facilitating people to be better communicators, whether it's working with our leaders, whether it's enabling the tools and the framework. We have a certain lot to do, but it's to achieve that, it's bigger than it's going to take everybody.
Yeah, I also think it's important with employee experience and understanding exactly why you're doing what you're doing. And I think people often forget, what are the business objectives and what are you trying to achieve across the business, and why is it that we need to do this specific. The reason I'm saying this is because I've seen a lot of blogs and a lot of articles about people putting in ping pong tables and donut Thursdays and pizza Fridays and all that kind of under the disguise of employee experience. But is it actually is it actually having any benefit in the organization by doing that? And I think sometimes you can get carried away in the enthusiasm of employee experience and making sure that everyone's having a great time and doing what they're doing, which is fab. But are they actually, at the end of it all, the outcomes, are they actually delivering what the business needs them to deliver? And have they got the tools, techniques, and the skill to do that? And I think we need to drive that conversation with our teams.
Absolutely. And the concept now is around psychological safety and how we create that. And that's a really, rather than thinking about ping pong tables, as you talk about, Vita, it's actually how are we making this place a psychological safe environment where that we are enabling people to bring themselves and bring their experiences and make them lived and shared.
Exactly. This is really good. And I mean, it comes back to something that we talk a lot about at SMARP as well, is like how to ensure that communicators can kind of drive this business impact, and whether that's through enhanced employee experience or through enhanced communication. I think that's something that all IC people definitely should try to do. It goes back again to just being a little more assertive, trusting that you have the tools and the capabilities to do what the organization needs from you. But we have so many great questions on this next topic that I would just want to hop right into it and get your guys' input. So the next statement is, middle managers are key to successful communication in the organization. And Advita, how about we start with you?
This may be controversial, but I think they are. I know there's been debate. I've seen some questions on popping up on there about middle managers and communication, but they are the sandwich between the leadership team and the guys on the operational workflow, that and people look up to them, whether we like it or not, whether they're good or not, and whether they do the right job. People do look at them for advice, guidance, and support. So definitely, I do think they are key to successful comms. All right. So we'll see what the other two think.
All right, Brad, what do you think?
Can't live with them and you can't live without them. I guess I would have to agree, again, based upon some research work and this essential role they play. I think that what I would say is that they're one part of the equation, and they need to play that role successfully to be able to have a successful environment.
All right, sounds good. Jen, how about you?
Yes, I agree. I'm always a tentative agree, because as you say, you can't live without them, you can't live with them. But I think that we have to also I think we've got to work better at them, absolutely, but we must also be aware of how the role of the middle manager is going to evolve. And I think if we say too much focused, yes, I think we need to think wider than just middle manager. I think whether that's project supervisor, project team, you know, we must think outside traditional hierarchical sometimes structures, because the way org design is going to change may mean that the middle manager in some respect is different. I think that they are absolutely important, the person that we have the trust with, but where we need to understand how trust is going to shift in organizations as organization design shifts, and it's finding the trust points, and whether that's a middle manager always, or whether they will exist in that way, I'm not entirely sure.
Right. And this brings up, like, again, from the previous kind of face-to-face discussion we have a bunch of great questions in here. This one particularly from, and a few on this same line of thinking. Luis had a great question that is it our role in IC to help our leaders / line managers to become better communicators? Whether that's face-to-face or in general, what do you guys think about? Is it the role of IC to coach, you know, middle managers or line managers or whoever needs it?
I think we have the skills to do that, yeah. So I rather somebody in my internal comms team coach the manager in how to communicate effectively than somebody who thinks they may know how to do it properly. I don't think, you know, in my belief is as much as we can support and help them do a good job, we should try and do that. So I've done things like lunch and learns at lunchtime to talk about key line manager techniques and tools. We've created guides to help them on how to establish a conversation or have a difficult conversation, how to negotiate. But I think, you know, we have got those skills as internal communicators to do that. So I don't see why we wouldn't support where we can.
I think we should do, I agree. But clearly it's not because we're not moving that needle. So clearly there's something that we are not doing, or we're not getting the buy-in or doing that to make that real change. I think, again, I think we have the skills to help coach, but we need to work on our stakeholder and our influence abilities as internal communicators and shout louder about our capabilities, because at some point there is a decision about how managers, influencers, supervisors are bequeathed that responsibility, and communication ability is nowhere in that decision. And if we're thinking about employee experience as a future, you've got to bring that communication ability into the organization context. So there's somewhere along the line, we as a profession, and I'm not saying I know what the answer is, need to work out how to influence that dialogue and make that shift and get that changed, which is going to take greater stakeholder, greater collaboration, and probably greater business acumen to show the impact that lack of ability, of communication ability, is having on organizational performance.
Well, I'd almost go a step further and say we maybe need to redesign the whole role of a middle manager. I mean, if you think about it, it sort of harkens back to they are a key part of a cascading communication system. They were that last link between, you know, sort of leadership and the front line. And they were invented at a time when we did not have effective mass communications tools. We did not have a great peer-to-peer communications system set up. And we had employees who were sort of waiting for the official voice to come their way through their immediate manager. Middle managers, supervisors are extraordinarily busy. Spans of control have increased. I think we all sort of say, you know, they don't necessarily have to convey some of the information that they may have once been expected to carry, but maybe they're the ones who provide context. I think we need to re-examine the whole question, because I think sometimes you see self-managed work teams where the supervisor is sort of a part of. So yeah, let's examine their communications role and how and what and how they go about doing this. And then what does this new sort of manifesto for the middle manager look like today? And I would say that communications is a key part of it, but it's probably a different thing than what it may have been 2 years ago, 5 years ago, or 10 years ago.
I agree. I agree.
Really good and insightful stuff. And guys, again, we have 12 minutes to go, and I think we need to head on to the final statement. And this is one that I've been waiting for, because I know that this will get a lot of people riled up, especially if they're in IC. So the last statement goes: it is impossible to measure ROI on communications programs. Brad, how about you go first?
I'd agree. I think we can make feeble attempts at doing so, but I also think that the difference between sort of the investment and the outcome, there's so much great distance and there's so many variables in this equation that it's really hard to pin a specific ROI to an investment.
Gotcha. Okay, next up, how about Jen? What do you think?
I disagree. I think we need a little bit of, disagreement on this one. I think there is to measure or say or continuous need in generality of internal communication to really key corporate business KPIs is extremely challenging. But if you're taking the internal comms programs approach, I think that there is absolutely the opportunity to link and demonstrate ROI. And I think that has to start with much, much better planning. We are not very good at our planning and actually really thinking that through so that we make that pre and post ability to demonstrate our impact and actually make those objectives and the things that we write be able to really link to specific ROI KPIs that will be of value upwards. I think is absolutely possible, not in every instance, but I think that we are not investing enough of our time into really considering that.
Gotcha. How about you, Advita?
I disagree with the statement. I think it's not impossible. It's hard. It is hard. I'm not saying it isn't, and it's hard because some people just don't know what it is, how to do it. It's a new way of working for us, and I think it all links into all the other statements we did before about, if we can't prove our value as internal communicators and what contribution we're making to the bottom line, then I think we'll always be just seen as a function that just sends out things, or as someone that budget can be stripped from quite quickly because it's not a needed resource. And I am so passionate about this area because I do think we have such an umbrella view of over the organization that we can definitely prove our value. We can look at return on investment. We can definitely measure our programs and campaigns, but we just need to have the appetite to do that. We need to have the skills to do that. And we need to understand what data actually means and move away from focusing on outputs, focus on more on outcomes and behaviors.
Right.
And I'd like to violently disagree with the former Brad who said that he disagreed, because I think you sort of hit upon an important point. We need to become much better at measurement, evaluation, data, statistics, analysis. I guess my point is that when most people hear about ROI, they think of a simplistic cause and effect. I invested this and I had this outcome. And I think sometimes, unless it's a very, very short, controlled environment, it's really tough to measure anything like that. The hard one is to sort of look at over time, we've put this much money into internal communications, and what's the result? And how do you measure it? And it's so many variables, so many factors. Is it, non-voluntary turnover, voluntary turnover? Is it a Glassdoor rating from outside? Is it some sort of a metric that's built into your engagement survey that you do on an annual basis? What is that return on investment? So while I think we are getting much more disciplined as a profession at doing measurement, holding ourselves accountable for, I think this idea of we invested this much and where's the return on it, we need to start teaching people about correlation as opposed to causality.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. I think it's trying to make that financial, you're taking that marketing approach to ROI. It's very different because we approach things in a very different financial construct. But I think that if you I've seen examples of it here. And it's funny, I think there's a debate as well happening around the structure of internal comms and actually how we're building different specialism skills within our teams. There's some here that obviously you generally have head of internal comms and channel managers, but there's some people that are starting to build in planning and insights teams within their internal communication function. I know we're all lucky they've got a lot of budget. How do they get that? That's another question for another debate. But by investing in that structure and that framework, and then therefore then having a business partner model that's aligned, then we're really able to go in and go, right, these are some problems happening, right? They had an example there was a decision-making bottleneck.
Right.
Because people weren't feeling empowered. So let's do an internal comms campaign to change that empowerment behavior. And by doing that pre and post, I think they were able to make a financial demonstration of their what they gave to the organization that year, which isn't based on spend and profit.
Right. And I love this discussion because I mean, actually, it's smart. We're working on a new, pretty cool analytics platform. So, shameless plug. Stay tuned. But one thing I wanted to bring up here still was there's a question from an earlier topic on employee experience that I see got brought up again, and I know Brad answered in chat with some good insight. But what do you guys think are some good measurements? And if you can tie it also into employee experience, what was talked about earlier, what are some good measures on employee experience or internal communications in general?
I think, sorry, Jen, I was just going to say, one that's worked for me in the past is definitely, what I found about leaders is that where they're losing money, that's where they're interested in how they can save more money. So absence is always a big one, retention, anything to do with people that HR hold that data is very key to your kind of measurement success, I would say. If you can look at, measure and track absence across the business, you don't need to know individual absence. You probably get some pushback from some HR person to say that it's confidential data, but all you're really looking for is a pattern across a few months to see what's going on in that specific area and how you can match up to see why, dig a bit deeper on why that's happening and use the actual data points, quantitative stuff, but also qualitative in terms of getting that feedback. So my advice to anyone who may be struggling to look for data points is connect with your teams and departments who hold data. You'd be surprised where you can find it. Health and safety teams, IT teams, HR teams, they all have some really rich data that you can interpret and use for your own gain as well. I don't think you need to worry too much about, we don't have the right tools or technology. You may not have the fancy newsletter that tells you click-through rates and follow that through. And output's important, but it's the outcome stuff that the leadership team at that board table will definitely be paying attention to.
The other quick thing I would suggest as well for EE is in the future, if you look at organizations, the fight for talent is rife. Getting good skills in your organizations to drive innovation, productivity, it's now more of an employee's market than ever before. We have the gig economy, people aren't looking at things in that way, so they know they need to get the best talent to get that best thing. So, you could even just do a simple EPS score. As a way of looking at, are we developing ourselves as a good reputation to attract talent in? And also you could map that against your NPS score. It's a simple method, but it will give you something to measure employee experience.
One of my favorite gurus on this topic is a guy by the name of Jim Schaefer, and his view of internal communications, he worked for Towers Perrin for many, many years, is not at the macro level, but it's at the micro level. And he said communications is all about getting a work group to be able to tackle a business issue. We're having quality issues in this group. How do you get the people together to be able to solve this as a group and affect that bottom line, change the results? They can make millions of dollars of improvements if they're empowered, if they're allowed to communicate, if they help make some of the business decisions. So you need to do that, I would also say, in an environment where you understand what the overall direction of the organization is. So part of our role, again, is creating this communications environment where you can be effective at that front line, make a difference, be able to measure your input and output, especially around business results, but still have it going in the same direction that the entire organization is and following that general leadership. And I think our job in communications is to make sure that all these pieces are working from that micro to the macro.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think something you guys have all been talking about here is, not focusing too much on, the reads, the clicks, the likes, the stuff like that, but also measuring against actual kind of outputs and business goals and business objectives, and all of that ties into becoming, making the whole IC profession more of a kind of strategic function in the business rather than just I think we had it was Sue Dewhurst, an author in the UK who talked about the concept of the lickers and stickers, that internal comms people used to be lickers and stickers because, you would lick a stamp and stamp it on the post or the envelope and mail it. So really shifting away from kind of the tactics to the actual outcomes is super, super important.
One final point, Alex. I think it's one of the best things I've ever done. I'm not a numbers person by any stretch of the imagination. So one of the best things I did was educate myself on the numbers and did a course for finance for non-finance managers. And I highly recommend that if you're an internal comms person who works in a quite commercially driven organization that needs to make that impact, then look it up. You can do it online, and you can also go into a class, but it's the best investment I've made in my own development, understanding data and numbers and finance figures, to have that rich conversation with leaders in the business. Because I think that's the one thing that puts a fear in comms people in particular, that some of the complexity around what some of the acronyms mean is a big, a stopper for us moving forward. So definitely invest in that if you can, and it's one of the best courses I've done in a long time.
Perfect. I think that is actually a pretty good spot to end it on. Advita, if you could go ahead and also tweet out that last piece of advice you had. Everybody go check out Advita Twitter, check out all of our speakers on Twitter, all of our amazing experts, and thank you guys again for joining the Comms Debate 2 to share your insights today. The Comms Debate 2 has come to an end, but don't worry, everybody. We are making the Comms Debate a quarterly thing. So we're actually coming back with the Comms Debate 3 in April. And we already have some speakers lined up for that. But if you're interested in speaking at a future Comms Debate event, feel free to drop us a message, reach out to me on LinkedIn, do whatever you have to do to get a hold of me. But while we're waiting for the Comms Debate 3, we have another webinar or another live session coming up on February 26th. Go check that out. It's called Comms Trivia, and everybody that tunes into that one will have a chance to win a prize. But yeah, you guys, any last words of wisdom before we nod off?
Don't be afraid. It's all good. Go forward, build relationships, have conversations, and you're really great at what you do.
Take it to the next level. I think that's the other one, is don't be afraid, don't repeat the past, don't be satisfied with the status quo. I live in Silicon Valley, where engineers are always trying to come up with that next new product, more powerful, more. And I think the same thing is true for us. We need to find ways to just like amp it up.
Don't be afraid to ask why, and and use that wisely, I would say.
I love that. Well, that is a great notion to end it on. And guys, again, thank you for joining. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in and listening. This was another great session. And yeah, see you guys at the next one.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye.